So let me just start and say, Andreina, I'm having a very big pleasure to say welcome to Urbcast and welcome to our series, the Nocturnal Cities.
Thank you so much, Marcin. I'm very happy to be part of this series and to be part of this podcast.
I'm very excited about the topic we are about to discuss because, as we've just discussed while preparing ourselves to the series, this topic is such a popular topic nowadays. There was such a big boom in that topic if we talk about the nighttime governance and nighttime economy, nocturnal cities overall. And I had this desire to kind of collect this information and present it in a very kind of accessible way. And I think that you are a perfect person to talk to because you are an expert in the topic yourself. So maybe just starting the series, kicking it off, could you say, what is your connection to the nocturnal cities and why is it important to talk about them, especially nowadays?
Yes, of course. I'm very happy to and excited to talk about this topic that I've been fascinated about for the past, I would say, over 15 years. So when we talk about nocturnal cities or we talk about the night in urban terms, we refer to the period that goes from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. So in other words, it's the other half of the day. What happens at night, but also what connects to all kinds of activities, active social activities that represent the nighttime economy. And I became fascinated with this topic and this sector in urban planning and urban studies when I was quite young and I was growing up in my hometown of Caracas in Venezuela, which at the time was one of the most dangerous and violent cities in the world. And growing up as a girl, as a woman in an environment where the night becomes is such a difficult space to penetrate, to understand, I became fascinated by what other cities were doing to conquer the night, to understand the night, and to use it as an opportunity rather than a space that is challenging and dangerous and intimidating. So I began doing these observation studies in a very naive way with a friend of mine, with a sociologist. We began observing life at night in different public spaces in the city. And when I say public spaces, this is very important because in Latin American cities and in a city like Caracas, most nighttime activity happens in private spaces. So it happens in shopping malls or in restaurants or in people's homes. So we used to go to a very important boulevard, Boulevard Sabana Grande in Caracas, and we used to sit there with our notebooks and take notes. So what's happening at 6 p.m.? What's happening at 7? Who's walking around? Who's coming and going? What's their age? Are they going home? Are they going to a bar? Are they taking public transportation? So we were observing these different activities and trying to unpack what was happening in the city at night. And we realized that we were tapping into a growing field, something that was happening and booming in different parts of the world, particularly in Europe, in the UK, in North America, but it was growing. It was known as night studies. So we tapped into this field without even knowing, and it became my obsession. It became something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm lucky to now be able to say that my hobby became what I do, became my profession and what I'm expert on.
So how did this understanding of the night change for you? Because that was a big discovery that you just technically just went out in the night or in the evening and wanted to observe the cities, almost as a young girl and his wife did. They just started observing life, which created this whole discipline of very people-friendly urban design. So what was kind of your first of the observations you started to collect as someone who was back then still quite unexperienced in the topic?
It's funny that you mentioned Gail, because it's funny how life goes in circles, and I'll get back to Gail in a bit. But so when I started doing this work, these observations, I'm a journalist, so I was working in communications back home, and I was actually involved. My role was as information manager in a municipality in Caracas. Caracas, my hometown, has 5 municipalities, and I was responsible for managing press and communications for one of these municipalities and helping the newly appointed mayor with his communication strategy. And as part of my job, one of the things that landed on my lap was the possibility of helping organize this amazing event that was called Por el medio de la calle, which is in the middle of the street. And it was inspired by Nuit Blanche. I don't know if you know about Nuit Blanche, but it's a very important festival, and it's one night a year, in Paris, where different kinds of cultural producers, museums come together and they reclaim the night as a space for creativity, for cultural production, for socializing. And inspired by Nuit Blanche in Paris, there's been all kinds of Nuit Blanche events around the world. And in Latin America in particular in the early 2000s, this was growing a lot. So when I was working in this municipality, back in Caracas in 2009, I was told that we were going to do one of these events, a Nuit Blanche event in Caracas, in partnership with many embassies and with cultural institutions, and that we were going to try to reclaim the night as a positive space through culture, through dance, through music. And I thought, wow, this is fascinating because it's connected very well with what I was observing, how life at night is something that can help, citizens reappropriate the space in a positive way, reclaim the space in a positive way. And so this was a festival, this event, Por el Medio de la Calle, had been growing organically, organized by a local publication. And that year that I was working in the municipality, we joined forces with this publication, with all these embassies, and it became a massive event. I'm talking about 40,000 people walking around the streets of Caracas at night, people from different parts of town, because something that happens a lot in contexts that are as polarized as a city like Caracas at the time is that you don't get to meet other people that are different from you. You always go to the places that you feel you're safe. So it's very, indoors, private oriented. So in this case, you were able to walk around the city at night to experience art, music, culture, and also to, interact with people from different parts of town and really get to know the other, get to know your city. So it was a great, fantastic experience that then led me to, when I was doing my master's degree in London a few years later, I decided to study this. So that was how I got started in this field. And I asked a question, which was, who owns the night? Who is the owner who appropriates the night? And in this case, I wrote a dissertation about the relevance of the night from a social perspective, particularly for young people. As I was growing up in a city like Caracas, what's the role that the night plays in shaping our identities, in shaping who we are, and also in building social capital? If we're not able to use the night, to experience the night in a free way, what's the repercussion of that from a social capital perspective? So that's what got me started. And then I realized I had to do, of course, all these context research and like literature review. And I realized, wow, this is a field. It's a growing field. And it was emerging in different parts of the world, more from the geography perspective, sociological perspective. But I thought, what about studying this from an urban studies perspective? And that's what got me fascinated with this field. Years later, it led to pursuing a PhD on urban governance and specializing in nighttime urban governance, which is what I did right before COVID. And it made me understand that the night has so many dimensional, it's a multidimensional field that we have to understand as such, because it has not only social implications like the ones I started studying before, but also environmental and climate implications. It also has, of course, economic implications and many cultural implications that we should care about and should think about the night as a space that, like the day, that we study and we manage proactively rather than reactively in our cities.
So back in the years, Henry Lefebvre was asking about who owns the city. And now you're extending that with the field of nighttime governance to basically asking who owns the night. And this is a brilliant question. I'm wondering, it's fascinating that your journey was such an interesting one when you've been like discovering every bit of the nighttime governance. And I wonder, how does it happen and how did it happen in your case and in terms of this development of this whole field? The cities were there for hundreds and hundreds of years, and so was the night. The night in the city is not something new. So why do you think it happened that this field emerged recently very rapidly, with more and more knowledge being created, with more and more studies, and with more and more people thinking about it, talking about it, and observing it as yourself?
Yes, that's a great question. So from an urban perspective, it's important to understand that, unfortunately, time planning and nighttime governance have been addressed insufficiently. And the origins of this field can be traced back to the 1990s. And it's in the 1990s when a number of cultural and urban theorists began using this temporal approach to think about what are the physical and the social dimensions of planning in the post-industrial city. So we started looking at this post-industrial centers and what's the possibility of occupying, of using these spaces throughout the 24-hour cycle. And we ran into many opportunities, but also many challenges. So the way the nighttime governance and nighttime studies have been evolving, it's been evolving in waves, so to speak, from the first wave of understanding the night as a space to expand the possibilities of the uses of an area, but then realizing that, of course, this can lead to many instances of challenges of coexistence or the rise of antisocial behavior linked in many cases to the consumption of alcohol in urban centers at night, but then also to more recently studying what kinds of institutions can be involved in managing cities at night. And that's what leads to the concept of nighttime governance, because when we think about nighttime governance and the concept of governance on itself is basically involving going beyond government and involving other kinds of actors, whether it's community or private actors in managing a city or an area of a city. And in this case, nighttime governance looks at the broader and broadening cast of actors involved in managing cities at night, and particularly the role of night mayors and nighttime managers that has been proliferating over the past, I would say, 10, 15 years around the world. I began as part of my doctoral studies. We did, along with a former night mayor, the former night mayor of Amsterdam, Merrick Milan, he and I, and he's responsible for kickstarting this movement. We call it a movement because it began with a few cities like Berlin and Amsterdam appointing these night mayors or night figures, and it becoming a movement around the world where more than 80 cities nowadays have these dedicated offices or individuals who are responsible for managing life at night. And around 2018-19, Merrick and I sat together and we said, so it's growing. There's many cities doing this. So what does this mean? And let's take stock on what's happening and understand who are these night mayors that are proliferating around the world. So we did a survey. We did a qualitative survey and we got information data from, at the time, was 30-something night mayors around the world to understand who they were. So what are their ages, gender, what kinds of resources they have, if they work with a team, if they work individually, to get a sense of what this night mayor movement was. And it's really interesting because that was the foundation of thinking about nighttime governance as the symbol or the expression of how cities are thinking about the night in a different way. Because when you think about the night is often seen in contraposition to the day. So while the day is organized and transparent and structured, the night is often seen as chaotic, as a space for fear, for antisocial behavior, for problem, for chaos. So the fact that these night mayors and institutions were showing up around the world was a sign. We took it as a sign that there was change and that cities were interested in thinking about the night from a different perspective. So yes, it emerged from a cultural point of view in the 90s, the night as a field, but then these new institutions helped place the night in the urban agenda, and now it's become a new subfield, I would say, within the urban disciplines.
And this topic basically of emerging from very early on, more of an activism towards where we are right now. So where basically a position and role like a night mayor exists in many cities. And this is something that we want to cover in one of the episodes of our series as well, because I think that it really deserves its own story, so to say. How did it change? Because you could say that, yeah, basically like not many people would think about the night and that you can actually go out and study, or that you can actually even manage how a city is curating the night. So this is very fascinating. And that was, as you said, the development over the last couple of years. So where are we now? We have more and more cities getting mayors. I know that there are even nighttime mayors starting to emerge in cities in Poland, which really makes me happy. So if we talk about 2020, 2025, as we are speaking right now, where do you feel like where do you feel the field is right now?
That's a great question, and I think, and we'll get into more detail, as you said, on what the shifts and the changes have been in these movements. But one thing I should mention is that over the past, so 5 years ago, when COVID hit, when the pandemic hit, this was a very important moment, a before and after for nighttime governance and planning. And of course, when you think about it, what we were experiencing at the time, one day, suddenly overnight, everything was shut down. We had lockdowns, and most of the activities that take place at night, naturally, particularly those linked to socializing and culture, were stopped. They came to a halt. Also, from a transportation, from a mobility perspective, our 24-hour mobility systems like the New York City subway stopped for the first time in many, many years. So we saw a very important break in the 24-hour city dynamic, in the 24-hour city idea. And it led also to some of these nightmares and nighttime institutions that were already emerging to stop and connect. And one important moment that happened in 2020 was that some of us, including, as I said, Merrick Bilan, the former night mayor of Amsterdam, but also Lutz Lessering, who is his partner in Vibe Lab, a consultancy that looks at these issues, as well as with a professor, with Michael Finchman from UPenn. We came together and we started talking about, so what does this mean for the COVID? What does it mean for nighttime ecosystems? And we started discussing the possibility of bringing together this community of night mayors and advocates and starting to share knowledge and best practices. Well, I don't like to say best practices, but practices, because sometimes what works in a context doesn't really work in another. But we started sharing ideas, and it was the foundation for this new stage of this global movement of nighttime planning that we are at the moment. So nowadays, where we are is that we saw that throughout the COVID years, this international collaboration crystallized. There's now new mechanisms for international night advocates and mayors to communicate, from a global WhatsApp group to all kinds of conferences that happen annually, some of them, and they bring together all these advocates. So now there's more and more opportunity to exchange knowledge and to learn from each other, because although each city has its own regulatory tradition, each city has its own types of institutions, in the end, we're seeing that most cities are sharing some of the main challenges when it comes to managing life at night, whether it is fighting the impacts of gentrification over, areas. It's the classic cycle of gentrification. You have a post-industrial area in a city, for example, that became really cool and hip and innovative through artists and nightlife businesses. But then because it became so cool and hip, it attracted more development. And then there's residential buildings. And then suddenly people are complaining about the nightlife businesses and the creatives that were there in the first place. So those kinds of tensions lead to displacement. So we're seeing that in many cities around the world, nighttime activity or cultural activity has been displaced to the outskirts of the city. Or in some cases, we see how there's the need to think about night spaces from an inclusion perspective. So back to the question, who owns the night? Who has the right to the night? Who can access night spaces? Because we have to recognize the importance of these spaces to socialize and to build identities, but also people who work at night, people who use the night as their platform, as their space for productivity. So we have to think about the night as a space, time in the city that is not monolithic. We experience the night based on who we are, based on our age and our gender, based on whether we're people who are, enjoying the night to socialize, or if the night is a space where we work, if we work in a hospital, if we work in logistics, if we work in the port here in Barcelona, if you work, if you work at night, your perspective and perception of the night is totally different. Nowadays, going back to your question, what's happening is that we're seeing how this broader articulation of this new sector, of this new nighttime governance ecosystem, has led to be able to evolve from advocacy into discussing. So night mayors have been evolving from very young advocates that we saw in that original study. When we did that qualitative study, we saw that most night mayors were quite young, very limited resources. But now many of them have evolved to becoming lobbyists and politicians, because now they have to move from advocacy to changing regulations, to updating policies, to looking at what are the categories of licensing in the city? Are they relevant, or are they obsolete? Do we need to think about new ways to enable nighttime activity to happen, to enable different uses to happen throughout the 24-hour cycle in the same building or the same lot? And for those innovations, that kind of innovation to happen, you need more robust institutions and also individuals that have bigger training and also bigger political access. So what we're seeing is an evolution into from advocates to policymakers, and also we're seeing an expansion of the types of the scope of nighttime planning and policy. So from more culturally focused, nightlife focused topics to what I like to call life at night, which involves different aspects from the production and consumption perspective, and also that involves thinking about well-being and wellness throughout the 24-hour cycle, to thinking about climate impacts at night, and to thinking about sustainability and inclusion as a whole when it comes to the 24-hour city.
I think it was such a big game changer to the cities, and especially to the nighttime time of the cities. I mean, the COVID here, right? Because it did not only influence the studies and the field of its own, but basically the night time, the night part of the life in our cities basically died out. Like there was no parties, no restaurants almost open during the night or during the evenings, and basically the cities just shut down in a way. But obviously, like, people were still there, people were eager, people were hungry to go out and party, and especially like in some cultures associated with people like going outside late. Like, for example, Latin countries and Spain and Italy in Europe, you would obviously expect people to go out. And I think that was like a live urban laboratory to observe how people react and how it changes. Back in the days, you've also mentioned that you've been working on your PhD. It was called, let me just read it, Governing the Urban Night, Understanding the Shifting Dynamics of Nighttime Governance in Three Global Cities. And towards the end of your thesis, the COVID happened. So you were a bit worried that actually it's going to change a lot of your work. So you decided to add up the episode or the part about COVID towards the end of your thesis. And when you reflect on that right now, how did it influence your thinking, and where is your understanding of the topic nowadays after those couple of years? Like your kind of personal understanding.
That's a great question. So, when I decided to write my dissertation on nighttime governance, first I faced many challenges because I was at the Harvard GSD, and I was the only person doing research on this field at the time. Now it's incredible how many students and academics are looking at night studies globally. But at the time, and this was 2017, I was on my own. And I decided to look at the cities, 3 cities that are the OG, the foundation of nighttime governance. So, of course, New York, Amsterdam, and London, with 3 very different traditions of regulatory arrangements and institutional arrangements, but 3 cities that have created the foundation for this movement that we now know. And I decided to spend some time in each of these cities to understand these mechanisms and to understand these traditions, and to do this comparative analysis of what these nighttime governance arrangements mean. And I was very, very close to graduating. I was very, very close to defending my dissertation. My defense was actually April 9, 2020. And I remember a few days before the defense that my advisor called me and she said, Reina, this is not going to happen. Like, your defense, I mean, the room in the school was booked. My advisors, one of them, Will Straw from McGill University, was coming from Montreal for the defense. Everything was organized, and Diane, my advisor, said it's not going to happen. So let's think about this strategically. And she gave me one of the best pieces of advice I've ever received. She said, don't stop now. So write an epilogue on how this crisis, this pandemic that we still cannot see where it's going because it was March 2020. She said, I anticipate this is going to be bigger than what we can see at the moment. So think about how this crisis impacts these nighttime governance regimes that you're studying, and think about what does it mean to look at time, to look at urban processes from a temporal perspective when these elements, when the world as we know it is coming to a halt. And I started thinking about, what references we have. I started reading, of course, like we all did. I think we all watched all kinds of movies about epidemics, and we read all kinds of papers about the plagues. And I did read, there's a chapter in one of Jane Jacobs' books. I think it's in Death and Life of Great American Cities. It's one of the final chapters. She has a quote about cities reinventing themselves in moments of crisis, and how crisis help us innovate in ways that we would have never done if we hadn't had to really challenge ourselves and think in different directions and think outside of the box. So I wrote an epilogue under this perspective, and thinking about how nighttime governance and these emerging and very young institutions that night mayors were, how they were challenged to rethink themselves in the context of a crisis. And what ended up happening was that we saw how these new nightmares became the pillars of the transformation of their nighttime ecosystems locally. So one thing that was incredible that happened at the time was that this WhatsApp group, a global group of connecting nightmares from all over the world, was created by Vibe Lab. And what started happening was that I was added to this group, and I woke up in the morning with messages. So this is happening in Estonia. Oh, this is what's happening in Bogota. Or we just realized that this regulation has been imposed in London. What do we do? So it led to collaboration in times of crisis, and it led us to thinking in terms of what was later called the Global Nighttime Recovery Plan. So we worked globally in these chapters that looked at how to use spaces outdoors at night, how to build more flexible, open, and innovative clubbing experiences in the middle of a crisis, how to think about, working for support models for nightlife industry workers and individuals in vulnerable populations. So we started thinking about how to do these things together. But I think it was this pandemic that pushed us to think in different directions. And so going back to my dissertation, so I wrote the epilogue on what happened. And I think if I hadn't followed this piece of advice from my advisor, my dissertation would have just been obsolete immediately, because things changed so much that in the end, what we learned was that the value of nighttime governance is precisely to have these eyes and ears, these people who are actively on the ground in their cities, thinking about nighttime ecosystems, representing the interests and the needs of people who are vulnerable because they work at night, because they're not protected, because they're impacted by many situations from a climate perspective, from a social perspective at night, whose rights were not necessarily taken into account. So the relevance of these institutions, I think, became clearer than ever during the COVID crisis. So for me, it was a very important thing to incorporate as part of my doctoral studies, and that shaped many things that happened after.
So maybe Jane Jacobs didn't foresee the COVID pandemic, but she did foresee the pattern that cities basically reinvent themselves during the crisis moments. And this brings me to kind of a summary question about some of those challenges, because you said that those challenges are about the inclusion. We also have this big layer of climate challenges. We obviously have affordability crisis and the vibrancy. And those challenges, those problems, they obviously do not disappear during the night. Maybe they even get bigger. How does it work? And how can we battle those challenges in our cities?
Yes, so I think one of the main things we're seeing in the field is that we're moving, and I'm going to use the words from Will Straw, one of my advisors from McGill University, how we're moving from the idea of festive nights into the night for those who work, and how we're moving into a broader consideration to all the forms of sociability and justice that exist at night. How a rich night in a city is one that extends out on time, but also is dispersed in spatial terms. And this is something very important, because what we saw during COVID was a tendency to decentralize our nighttime activity. When you look at nighttime or traditional entertainment districts, traditional zoning that connects to entertainment and to nighttime uses, these types of regulations tend to favor the agglomeration of nighttime activity in whether it is one corridor or one district, because the rationale behind this was that if you have all your nighttime uses close to each other, it's easier to manage. It's easier for the police to step in and to control in case there's something goes wrong. It's a very reactive approach, and we like to call it the pendulum approach, because it happens in we've seen it around the world, how some of the countries or the cities that were most restrictive when it comes to nighttime uses are now the most progressive. For instance, Sydney or New South Wales in Australia, with the lockout laws, were very, very restrictive a few years ago. They imposed a very tough curfew as a reaction to alcohol-related violence that happened at night. And now places like Sydney and New South Wales are some of the most progressive when it comes to the nighttime economy. But going back to the question, I think what we're seeing now after COVID is that rather than thinking in terms of, in spatial terms of concentrating and agglomerating all nighttime uses in one area, we're looking at ways in which we can decentralize this offer, because we realize that now, also because of the rise of technology and people teleworking, now people don't necessarily want to go find nighttime activity or services or leisure at night outside of the area where they live, going to the city center or going to a specialized district that offers them that kind of activity. But people want to have that opportunity closer to home. So the challenge is to look at time as a variable that just like space helps us distribute the impacts of activity, the concentration, the intensity of usage throughout the city. And there's really interesting policies, like for instance, in places like Amsterdam, there's been over the past, I would say, I think it's already almost 10 years old, or maybe a little bit older, a policy that looks at the creation of 24-hour licenses. So how in a place like Amsterdam, you had everything nighttime activity was concentrated in three main nightlife districts, one of them being the red light district, and how they saw with the rise of over-tourism, with the rise of many pressures from the real estate perspective, and also with the conflicts and the difficulty and challenges to sleep for people who live very close to these nightlife districts, there was a need to preserve nighttime activity, not get rid of it, but to preserve it in a way that it enables other things to happen. So what happened was that they created these licenses that allow nighttime or activity to happen throughout the 24-hour cycle. There's a number of establishments in the city that have the possibility to stay open around the clock. And one of the conditions for these establishments is that they have to be outside of these city center, these central areas, because it's a way to decongest, create an incentive scheme. So you can open later, you can stay open throughout the night, but you have to be located in this specific area. So it's using time as a variable. It's an incentive to decentralize certain activity. And when you look at places like Barcelona, like many cities around the world, like here in Barcelona, for instance, most nighttime activity, it's been, if you look at the map of nighttime activity in the city, 49%, almost 50% of nighttime activity is concentrated in only 3 districts. So that's a challenge. When you have everything concentrated in the same areas, instead of it being easier to control by the police, it's creating more nuisance. It's creating more challenges from a coexistence perspective. So what we're seeing after COVID is that there is now a need to rethink the way we organize and we allocate space and time in cities, and also to think about what are the impacts of nighttime activity from a climate perspective. And I don't know if maybe we can talk a little bit about that, if that's something that's relevant from a climate perspective and how that has been evolving.
Yeah, I think that here there is like such a clash and the challenge if it comes to the nighttime governance, because on one hand side, you would like some of this nighttime activity, especially the more festive and more loud, to be out of the city center. Ideally in some like some more urban industrial grounds, which happens, for example, in Copenhagen, where some of the big raves and parties would happen like outside of the city where there are no residents that could be potentially irritated by the noise. But while you do that, you take out some of the life as well out of the city. So that's pretty interesting. I think that we could wrap up with the climate now, and then tease out some of the next episode, because we're gonna dive into each of the topics. We've mentioned already the Australian perspective and this shift from being very, very strict to basically learning and adapting. I think we'll be discussing about city of Sydney, but also about the perspective of Amsterdam and some of the European cities. So maybe let's wrap up this episode that we have today, which is an introduction to the topic, with mentioning the climate, but also some of the other topics we want to cover and look at closer during our series.
Definitely. So as I said before, I think one of the main takeaways from the evolution of nighttime governance and from night studies over the past 15 years is how the experience of the night is not monolithic. And here I'll also connect to something that you mentioned before. So you mentioned Jan Gehl, and I was working with Gehl for the past couple of years. And I had the opportunity to think about, to even use some of the great methodologies and the great tools that are used by Gehl to study public life, to study how people behave in urban areas, to think about the night. And one of the things that's really interesting is to understand that the way we perceive life at night is based on many conditions. And one of these conditions is actually climate. So when we think of the night is interesting because it's both a cause and a consequence of climate change. There's two sides of the same coin. So on one hand, we have to think about how urban regions are adapting to higher temperatures. And to do so, we're shifting activities, more and more activities into the night. For instance, we are already seeing some changes in eating and sleeping patterns across Europe, Southern Europe, in Africa and Asia, and also like swimming in the Middle East and like the beaches in Dubai that made it to, articles in the New York Times last year. And also how there's adjustments to work schedules that are happening in regions that are facing extreme heat. And also, if you think about it, there's here in Spain and in countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, there's already regulations that are preventing certain workers from doing outdoor jobs during daytime heat waves and into moving these activities into the night for health reasons. But that's from the climate, from the adaptation perspective. But then also nighttime activities they imply an increased human impact in the environment. So the more nighttime activity we have, of course, we need to be able to function at night, to be able to operate at night. We need all kinds of, we need electricity. We need, typical nightlife industries like manufacturing, like data centers, like construction centers. They intensify energy consumption and emissions, and they exacerbate climate issues like urban heat island effects. So rising nighttime temperatures, they're linked to increased mortality, to problems with sleeping. They're also linked to, when you have more noises at night, they disrupt ecosystems, natural ecosystems, particularly wildlife and their natural behaviors. So then the night is in the middle. It's both an expression of the way we're adapting to climate change, but also it's also feeding into the climate problem by generating more emissions and generating bigger impacts. So what do? We have to think about how cities can play a more active role in understanding what are these shifting dynamics, what are these shifting behaviors, and also how through regulations, like I was mentioning before, thinking about 24-hour licenses or thinking about, flexibility in certain types of zoning or that allow intensity of use to be managed based on these climate impacts. So we need to be more sensitive, and we need to be more attuned to understanding what are the ways in which our impact on climate change is happening at night, but also in which ways we're adapting and make this cycle a bit more to contribute to the cycle in a more positive way. So I do think that there's a great opportunity from the climate perspective and from the night studies perspective to bridge these two areas, to bridge night studies and climate studies, and to think about ways in which we can add a more positive contribution to this field.
And this is such an important element that we're going to discuss about it as well in one of our episodes that we are planning for the series, which will be about shaping this academic debates on night and climate and talking about the nature of climate change. Because as you've said, this is already happening. And I'm really looking forward to some of the episodes because we will be talking about this shift from advocacy to action and policy. We'll discuss the nighttime climate. We'll discuss the acceleration of the nighttime ecosystems on the precinct level. So basically talking about the broader kind of scope for those decisions and the development. But also importantly, I would say the woman in the nighttime economy. And I think that when I've been already talking about the topic of the night and the lightning in the night and so on in this podcast, I think that one of the things that appeared and became very important is the notion of safety, which is very subjective. And I hope that we'll also talk about that in the series. To wrap it up, I would love to ask you about a book recommendation. And this is probably one of the many recommendations that we'll share during this series, but maybe we could start with this one element to inspire the people who would like to get to know even more about the topic.
I actually have two recommendations and I have them here. So if there's people listening who are interested in getting involved and getting and knowing more about the nighttime planning field, this is a foundational book. It's called Planning the Nighttime City by Marian Roberts and Adam Eldridge. And this is a book that I think it's a fantastic way to understand what's the relevance of the night from an urban perspective. As I said in the beginning, it was very much driven by geography and sociology, but this is what, helped move into the urban realm. So it's a fantastic book to get started if you want to read about planning the nighttime city. And then another recommendation is a book that I just picked up again recently. It's I'm a big fan of Bourdain, of Anthony Bourdain. And one thing I love about this book, about Kitchen Confidential, that if you haven't read it, it's a fantastic way of thinking about one sector of the nighttime economy, which is people who work in restaurants, gastronomy. And one thing that he mentions in this book is how he clearly articulated this temporal segregation that are faced by those who work the night shift. And he said that most of us who live and operate in the culinary underworld are in some fundamental way dysfunctional. And he explains that chefs and people who work in restaurants and in kitchens, they chose to turn their backs on the 9 to 5 and on ever having a Friday or a Saturday night off, or ever having a normal relationship with a non-cook. So it's a fantastic book to think about different, perspectives of the nighttime economy and those who work in this realm, and to think about it to be, more sensitive about the night, not only in terms of nightlife, enjoying the night, but also life at night as an ecosystem where many people, many people's livelihoods depend on the nighttime economy. So it's important to think about it in those terms too.
That's amazing, and that's completely okay. You shared two. And as I said, there will be probably more of them coming because we're going to have amazing guests. And I hope that each of them will be able also to share some interesting recommendation about reading and diving into topic a bit more. I'm very excited because this is the first episode out of the series, and we will gonna be co-hosting the series together. So I'm not saying goodbye, but I'm saying see you soon in the next episode of the series. And yeah, I'm very happy that we could kick off the series. So thank you for being part of Urbcast, and I'm looking forward.
Thank you, Marcin. Looking forward, and just leaving everyone with a phrase, which is Carpe noctem, which is seize the night as we seize the day as an opportunity to make our cities better.
Carpe noctem, seize the night.